In the summer of 1990, a small group of foreign scientists drove out across the open country of the southern Ural Mountains, deep inside the Russian heartland. They had come a very long way to look at a lake. From a distance, it seemed entirely unremarkable. It was a modest body of water, ringed by marsh grass and low reeds, resting quietly under a pale northern sky. Waterbirds moved along the shoreline. The surface was flat and calm. To the naked eye, it looked like 10,000 other small lakes scattered across that part of the world. One of the visitors lifted a radiation measuring instrument and aimed it toward the water. The needle climbed. Then it climbed further. Then it settled on a reading that none of them had ever recorded in open air, anywhere on the planet. The device was telling them something that the human eye could not perceive and the human body could not feel until it was far too late. A person standing on that gentle shoreline, on the soft ground beside those swaying reeds, was absorbing radiation at a rate of roughly 600 Röntgen every hour. At that intensity, a single hour on the bank of this pretty little lake would deliver enough radiation to kill a healthy adult within a matter of weeks. Those scientists had come from an American environmental research group, and the figure they carried home would soon see this place described in print as the most polluted spot on the entire planet. The lake looked peaceful. The lake was one of the most dangerous places that human beings had ever made. Its name was Karachay, a word drawn from the local Turkic languages. That means, fittingly, black water. But the men who had created its true nature did not call it by that name. In the sealed files of the Soviet atomic program, it carried a plain administrative designation. It was Reservoir 9. And that single word, reservoir, tells you almost everything you need to understand about how this place came to exist. Lake Karachay had not been poisoned by an accident. It had not been the victim of a single catastrophic failure. It had been chosen, deliberately, as a container. For decades, engineers had piped some of the most lethal liquid ever produced by human industry directly into its basin, treating a natural lake the way a household treats a drain. It was not a wound inflicted in a moment. It was a wound opened slowly, on purpose, over the better part of a lifetime. The term that governs this entire story is a Soviet phrase, the closed city. If the hidden machinery of the Cold War draws you in, the secret towns that never appeared on any map, the buried disasters, the decisions made behind sealed borders and armed checkpoints, then consider following this channel, where we reconstruct these stories from the declassified record and from the work of the scientists and dissidents who dragged them into the light. To understand how a country could knowingly build the deadliest lake on Earth and then hide it for a generation, we first have to understand the institution that ordered it done, and the fear that drove that institution to move faster than caution could keep pace. The place responsible sat only a few kilometers from the water. It was a vast industrial complex known as Mayak, a Russian word meaning lighthouse or beacon. Construction began in the years right after the Second World War, in a Soviet Union that had just watched the United States end that war with 2 atomic bombs over Japan. The message from Moscow was absolute. The Soviet Union would build its own atomic bomb, and it would build it as fast as physically possible, whatever the cost in money, in labor, or in human life. The program was placed under the direct control of Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the Soviet secret police, a man who understood deadlines and understood terror and understood almost nothing about the invisible poison his engineers were about to unleash. Failure, under Beria, was not an engineering setback. It was very often a death sentence. Scientists worked knowing that if the reactor did not produce, they might be shot or sent to the very labor camps that were supplying the workforce around them. That terror shaped every technical decision that followed. The Soviet program was not building in the dark. Through espionage, Moscow had obtained detailed knowledge of the American plutonium effort, including secrets passed by scientists working inside the wartime bomb project, among them the physicist Klaus Fuchs. Rather than risk their own untested designs, Soviet planners chose in the early years to copy what the Americans had already proven would work. This decision saved time, and time was everything. But it also meant importing the same fundamental blind spot that plagued the American effort. The whole world at that moment knew how to make plutonium far better than it knew how to safely store the ferocious waste that making plutonium left behind. Both superpowers raced to build the weapon first and resolved to worry about the poison later. At Mayak later arrived with a vengeance. The choice of the Urals for all of this was not random. The mountains sit deep in the interior of the country, far from any hostile border and far from the reach of enemy bombers, in a region already scarred and shaped by generations of heavy industry. Just as important, the area was dotted with lakes and threaded with rivers, and a plutonium works is an enormously thirsty thing, needing vast quantities of water to cool its reactors and feed its chemistry. The very abundance of water that made the site so attractive to the planners was the same abundance that would later carry the poison outward into the Tche and into that convenient little lake. From the very beginning, the geography that made the place possible also made the disaster possible. The two could never truly be pulled apart. Mayak was the Soviet answer to the American plutonium works, and it was raised at astonishing speed by an army of forced laborers. Tens of thousands of prisoners from the Soviet labor camp system, along with prisoners of war and conscripted soldiers, were marched into the forests of the Urals to dig the foundations and pour the concrete. They lived in crude barracks through brutal winters. They built the reactors, they built the chemical plants. They died in numbers that were never honestly counted, from accidents, from cold, from exhaustion, and, though they could not have known the word for it, from radiation. And around all of it, they built a town for the engineers and their families, a town that officially did not exist. That town appeared on no public map. It had no ordinary name. Mail was addressed to a post office box number in the distant city of Chelyabinsk, and so the settlement became known, in the flat language of Soviet secrecy, as Chelyabinsk 40. Later it would be renamed Chelyabinsk 65, and later still, after the Cold War, it would finally be allowed a real name, Oziorsk. Life inside the fence was a strange bargain. Its residents received good salaries, well-stocked shops, decent apartments, and a level of comfort that most Soviet citizens, standing in long lines for basic goods, could only dream of. In exchange, they surrendered the right to leave freely, the right to travel where they wished, and above all, the right to speak of what happened inside the perimeter, even to their own relatives on the outside. Historians who have studied these places have described them as bubbles of privilege sealed off from a poorer world, communities that were quietly bought with consumer goods and paid for that comfort with silence. The bargain held so deeply that, remarkably, even after the Soviet Union collapsed, many residents chose to keep their fences and their guards, rather than open their town to the chaos beyond it. The first reactor came alive in the summer of 1948. The engineers gave it an affectionate nickname, Nushka. Its purpose was not to make electricity. Its purpose was to bombard uranium with neutrons and slowly transform a fraction of it into plutonium, the silvery, intensely radioactive metal at the heart of a nuclear weapon. In the spring of 1949, the chemists at Mayak succeeded in separating the first batch of Soviet plutonium metal. That plutonium was shaped into the core of the first Soviet atomic bomb, a device the Soviets called RDS-1, which was detonated on a test tower in the steppe of Kazakhstan on the 29th of August, 1949. The American monopoly on the atomic bomb was over. In Moscow, there was triumph. Around Mayak, there was already the beginning of a disaster that would outlast the Soviet state itself, and the demand only grew from there. One reactor became several. Over the years that followed, Mayak would operate a whole series of production reactors, and the sprawling chemical plants needed to process their output, becoming the beating heart of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, the source of a large share of all the weapons-grade plutonium the country would ever make. Every kilogram of that plutonium meant more irradiated uranium dissolved, more acid baths, more separations, and more waste. The factory could not slow down. The arms race would not permit it. And the faster it ran, the faster the poison piled up, with nowhere truly safe to put it. Here we arrive at the central contradiction that drives everything that follows. The Soviet leadership believed the bomb would guarantee the survival of their nation. It was to be the ultimate shield, the thing that would keep the country safe from destruction. Yet, to forge that shield, they were about to render a portion of their own land uninhabitable for generations, sicken tens of thousands of their own citizens, and create a lake so venomous that it could kill a man where he stood. The weapon built to protect the homeland was quietly devouring the homeland from the inside. The border they were defending meant nothing to the poison. It seeped into the same rivers, blew on the same winds, and settled into the bones of the same people the state claimed to protect. And almost no one was allowed to know. To grasp how the poison was made, you have to understand a brutal and unglamorous fact about plutonium. Making it is overwhelmingly a chemical process, and that process produces staggering quantities of liquid waste. To extract a small amount of usable plutonium, the irradiated uranium fuel had to be dissolved in powerful acids and pushed through a long, elaborate series of chemical separations, stage after stage, to tease the plutonium away from the uranium and from the intensely radioactive fragments left over from the splitting of atoms. What came out the far end for every tiny portion of weapon-grade metal was an enormous volume of intensely radioactive liquid, laced with fission products that would remain dangerous for hundreds of years. There was at that time no good answer anywhere in the world for what to do with it. Picture the scale of the operation that produced it. Great chemical plants ran without pause, dissolving irradiated fuel in vats of boiling acid and moving the radioactive solutions through pipes and vessels behind thick shielding walls. The workers who ran these processes could not see most of what they handled and could not touch it directly. They guided the deadly liquids from behind barriers, watching dials and gauges, in an environment where a single leak or spill was not merely a mess to be mopped up, but a source of exposure that could quietly shorten a life. And for every gram of the prize they were chasing, the plants churned out far more of the liquid that nobody wanted. A rising tide of contamination that had to go somewhere immediately because the reactors upstream never stopped feeding the chemists fresh fuel to dissolve. Faced with rivers of this liquid and no proven way to store it, the men at MIAC improvised a rough hierarchy of disposal, and understanding that hierarchy is the key to the whole tragedy. The least contaminated water was released into the local environment almost freely. The middle grade, still dangerous, was piped into open water. And the most concentrated, most lethal, most heat-producing liquid of all was held back in special storage. This three-tiered approach was not written down as a careful safety philosophy. It emerged from desperation, from the simple fact that there was far too much waste and far too little time. Every level of that hierarchy would eventually fail in its own way, and each failure would teach the same lesson that the men in charge kept refusing to learn. The first failure was the river. In the earliest years, the engineers simply poured the most contaminated liquid they were willing to release into the nearest waterway. That river was the Techa. It was not a remote or empty waterway. Along its banks lived tens of thousands of ordinary rural people in dozens of villages, farmers and their families who had drawn their drinking water from that river for generations. They watered their livestock in it. They washed their clothes in it, children swam in it in the warm months. And mothers rinsed vegetables and filled kettles from it every single day. And beginning in 1949 and continuing for years, that river carried the waste of the Soviet bomb program straight through their daily lives. By the most cited estimates, several million curies of radioactivity in total were released into the Techa system across the whole period of dumping. The greater part of it poured in during the very worst early years, when the dumping was heaviest and the caution was least. The people who lived beside the water were never told. Consider what that silence actually meant for a single family in a village like Metlino or Maslumovo. A mother fills a bucket from the river to boil for tea. She has no reason to suspect the water. It looks the same as it always has, clear and cold and familiar. But the strontium dissolved in it behaves inside the human body almost exactly like calcium, which means it travels to the bones and settles there, irradiating the marrow from within for the rest of a person's life. The cesium behaves like potassium and spreads through the muscles and soft tissue. Within a few years, doctors sent quietly from Moscow began recording a strange cluster of illnesses along the Techa, a wasting sickness, blood disorders, and the slow onset of what would later be recognized as chronic radiation syndrome. Whole families sickened together without ever understanding why. The authorities responded not by explaining the danger, but by fencing off stretches of the river, by posting guards, and eventually by resettling thousands of villagers to new locations, often without ever telling them the true reason their homes had suddenly become forbidden. The scale of that quiet uprooting is easy to state and hard to feel. Thousands of people were moved from the most heavily contaminated riverside villages during the middle years of the 1950s. Metlino, the village closest to the plant and among the worst affected, was later erased entirely and submerged beneath the water of a new reservoir. To contain the river, the engineers built a whole chain of dams and holding ponds along the upper Techa, a cascade of artificial reservoirs meant to trap the contamination before it could flow downstream. That cascade still exists today, and it still has to be managed, its levels watched, its dams maintained, because behind them sits water that must never be allowed to spill. The name Muslimovo, one of the downstream villages, would become a symbol of the whole affair. Its people were studied for decades as the radiation in their bodies was measured and recorded. And yet, a genuine resettlement of the village did not come until the 21st century, in a slow and bitterly disputed program carried out more than half a century after the poisoning began. To reduce the flow of poison into the Techa, the engineers needed somewhere else to put the middle-grade waste. And so, beginning around 1951, they turned to the small lake sitting conveniently close to the plant. Lake Karachay had no outlet. Water flowed in, but nothing flowed out except through slow evaporation and seepage. To a Soviet engineer, under pressure to solve an impossible problem, that looked like a gift. A lake with no exit seemed like a natural holding tank, a place where the most concentrated liquid could be dumped and simply left to sit, cut off from the rivers, contained by its own geography. The reasoning was not insane on its surface. It was simply built on a single, unexamined assumption that the poison would stay where it was put. That assumption would prove to be catastrophically wrong, and it would take two separate disasters to prove it. For years, the dumping continued, quietly, methodically, out of sight behind the fences of a city that officially did not exist. The most contaminated liquid the program was willing to release went into Karachay, load after load, year after year. Slowly, invisibly, the little lake was transformed from within. Its bed became a layer of radioactive sludge, meters thick in places, a sediment that was in effect solid high-level nuclear waste sitting under a thin lid of water. The water itself grew more lethal season by season. Fishermen were kept away, the whole area was ringed with restrictions, and the men who ran the plant watched their radiation figures climb and told themselves the geography was holding, that the basin was quietly doing its job. The question none of them wanted to ask aloud hung over the still water anyway. What happens to a lake with no outlet when the weather changes, when the rains fail, when the water that was supposed to keep the poison safely submerged begins to disappear? Let us look closely at just how much death was accumulating in that basin, because the numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. Over the decades of dumping, Lake Karachay came to hold something close to 120 million curies of radioactivity. To put that beside a more familiar catastrophe, the explosion at Chernobyl in 1986 released a quantity of the long-lived isotope cesium that was only a small fraction of what lay in the mud of this one small lake. The crucial difference was geography. Chernobyl blew its poison across thousands of square kilometers of Europe, thinning it as it spread on the wind. Karachay concentrated a comparable and, in some measures, far greater burden of certain isotopes into a basin you could walk around in a single afternoon if walking around it would not have killed you. All of that lethality was packed into a space smaller than many city parks. That concentration was exactly what made the shoreline reading of 600 Röntgen an hour possible. The danger was not spread thin. It was gathered into one terrible point. It is worth dwelling on that word, concentration, because it is the whole reason this place holds the grim title it does. There are, of course, other radioactive sites in the world. There is the ruin of Chernobyl and its vast surrounding exclusion zone. There are the test grounds where bombs were detonated, and the other waste dumps left over from the nuclear age. But most of those either scattered their contamination thinly across enormous areas or sealed it away deep inside engineered vaults out of reach. Karachay was different in kind. It was an open, unshielded pool of concentrated, high-level waste sitting in broad daylight, where a person could simply walk up to the edge of the water and stand there, Nowhere else on the planet had so much raw lethality been left so exposed and so easy to approach. That was what the visitors' instruments confirmed. Not the largest release in history, but the single most intense spot on which a human being could actually stand. The two isotopes that mattered most were strontium and cesium, the same pair that had sickened the villagers on the Tekka. Both have a half-life of roughly 30 years, which means that even now, decades after the last major dumping, a large part of what went in is still present, still active, and will remain a serious hazard for centuries to come. The strontium is the more treacherous of the two in one respect. It dissolves readily in water and travels easily through soil, which meant that the poison in Karachi was never truly locked in place. It was always, slowly, trying to move. The cesium binds more tightly to sediment, which is part of why the lake bed itself became such an intense radiation source. Standing near the point where the freshest waste entered, as those American scientists discovered when they came, meant standing in a field of gamma radiation strong enough to be lethal in less than a single working shift. It was a place where time itself became a kind of weapon, where every extra minute on the bank shortened a life. Behind the abstraction of Curies and half-lives were human beings, and their suffering is the part of this story that the Soviet state worked hardest to erase. The workers inside Mayak absorbed enormous doses, especially in the frantic early years when protective measures were crude or ignored entirely in the rush to meet quotas set by frightened managers who feared Beria more than they feared radiation. Many developed chronic radiation syndrome, a slow degradation of the blood and the body that Soviet doctors at the plant came to know all too well. The population of Mayak workers hired in those first decades, numbering in the tens of thousands, would later become one of the most closely studied groups in the entire science of radiation and health, examined for the rest of their lives by a special medical institute in the closed city, precisely because they had been exposed so heavily and for so long their bodies became, in a grim sense, a scientific resource, a record of what chronic radiation does to a person written in flesh and bone. The secrecy reached even into the medical files of the very people it studied. Workers wore small badges that recorded the radiation they absorbed, and their doses were carefully logged, but the true meaning of those numbers was often kept from the workers themselves. A person might be quietly shifted to a less exposed job, or quietly treated for a mysterious illness without ever being told plainly what was wrong or why. Every part of the plant was compartmentalized. A chemist in one building could have no real idea what happened in the next. Even the doctors who understood radiation sickness best were bound to silence, forbidden, in many cases, to name aloud the cause of the very syndrome they were learning to recognize. In this way, Mayak did not only manufacture plutonium and waste, it manufactured a vast and careful ignorance, engineered as deliberately as the reactors, so that the people standing closest to the danger were often the least able to comprehend it. Downstream and downwind, the villagers absorbed their doses more slowly, through the water and the milk and the soil and the very dust of their gardens. It was a quiet poisoning spread across whole families and passed in the form of elevated illness and birth defects into the generations that followed. Mothers who had never worked a day inside the plant carried strontium in their bones. Children were born already carrying a burden they had inherited before their first breath. None of these people had been asked. None of them had been warned. There was no consent because there was no information. And there was no information because information was precisely the thing the state guarded most jealously of all. By the middle of the 1950s, the men running Mayak faced a mounting technical crisis that had nothing to do with the lake and everything to do with the third tier of their disposal hierarchy, the tanks. The most dangerous, most concentrated liquid of all was too hot, in every sense, to pour into any lake or river. It was stored instead in large steel tanks, buried underground and encased in thick concrete for shielding a facility the engineers monitored as carefully as they knew how. This waste was so radioactive that it generated significant heat all by itself, purely from the energy of its own relentless decay. To keep it from overheating, each buried tank was wrapped in a water cooling system that had to run continuously, drawing away the heat the way a radiator carries heat from an engine. The entire arrangement depended on those cooling systems working without interruption indefinitely, on equipment that no one had ever operated for so long under such conditions. In one of those buried tanks, the cooling system failed. The exact sequence has been reconstructed from the accounts that eventually emerged from Soviet and later Russian sources. The cooling on one tank broke down, and the failure was not caught in time. Some of the monitoring equipment had itself become unreliable in the harsh radioactive environment, so the men on the surface did not grasp what was happening in the darkness below their feet. Deprived of the water that carried away its heat, the liquid inside the tank began to warm. As it warmed, it started to evaporate, and the residue it left behind was a dried mixture rich in nitrate and acetate compounds, chemicals that are, in the right conditions, genuinely explosive. The temperature kept climbing inside the sealed concrete vault. The dried waste kept concentrating and drying further. What had been a tank of radioactive liquid was slowly, over weeks, transforming itself into something closer to a very large, very dirty bomb. And no one on the surface understood how close they were standing to a detonation. On the 29th of September 1957, in the late afternoon, the tank exploded. It was not a nuclear explosion, and this distinction matters. There was no chain reaction, no mushroom cloud, in the sense of a bomb test. It was a chemical explosion driven by those dried nitrate and acetate compounds finally reaching their limit. But it was enormous, with a force estimated at the equivalent of many tens of tons of conventional high explosive, powerful enough to hurl the tank's massive concrete lid, weighing well over 100 tons, clear off the buried vault as though it were a bottle cap. The blast tore open the containment and threw a towering column of radioactive material high into the autumn sky. In that single instant, roughly 20 million curies of radioactivity were released. Most of it fell back down close to the plant, contaminating the grounds of Mayak itself, but around 2 million curies rose high enough to be caught by the upper winds and carried away from the site. Witnesses in the region that evening reported a strange colored glow in the northern sky, an eerie light that some mistook for an unusual sunset or a distant aurora. They had no way to know they were looking at the luminous residue of the third worst nuclear accident the world would ever record. That wind carried the invisible cloud toward the northeast, and as it drifted, it began to rain contamination down across the countryside. The result was a long, narrow band of poisoned land, stretching for something like 300 kilometers, and reaching perhaps 30 to 50 kilometers across at its widest. On the maps that were later drawn in secret, this scar became known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace. It fell across farmland and forest and villages full of people who had no idea what had happened, who had seen only that glow in the sky and had no way to understand that the very ground beneath their feet had turned against them. The Soviet response revealed the true priorities of the system with brutal clarity. Evacuation, when it came slowly and unevenly. Some villages closest to the plant were cleared within about a week of the blast. Others were left in place for many months, and in a few cases for well over a year, while their inhabitants continued to eat food grown in contaminated soil, drink contaminated milk, and breathe contaminated dust, all without being told why officials had suddenly taken such a strange interest in their crops. In total, tens of thousands of people lived within the affected zone, and somewhere between 10 and 12,000 were eventually resettled away from the worst of the trace. Soldiers and local people, including in some cases children, were sent in to carry out the grim work of decontamination. They buried contaminated crops, slaughtered and buried contaminated livestock, and demolished abandoned homes, absorbing radiation with every hour of labor. Most of them never told the real reason for the work they were ordered to do. And then the entire event was made to disappear. There was no announcement, there was no acknowledgement, no warning was issued to the wider population, no lesson published for other nuclear operators, nothing. The accident was so completely buried in secrecy that the outside world would not learn of it clearly for another 20 years, and the Soviet government itself would not formally admit that it had happened until the very end of the 1980s. Because the true location was a secret city that did not appear on any map. The disaster, when whispers of it finally began to spread, would be named not for Mayak, but for the nearest ordinary town that did appear on maps, a place called Kishdim, which had almost nothing to do with the event itself. So the third worst nuclear accident in human history, ranked in severity behind only Chernobyl and the later disaster at Fukushima, came to be known forever by the name of a bystander town. It was a fitting emblem for a catastrophe defined, above all else, by concealment. There is a strange and haunting afterlife to that poisoned band of land, Yend. Some years after the explosion, a portion of the most heavily contaminated ground left behind by the trace was fenced off and turned, of all things, into a nature reserve. Close to farming, close to settlement, close to nearly every human being, the contaminated zone became an accidental wilderness. Scientists were permitted in to study what the radiation did to the plants and animals living there, and they found a landscape that was both damaged and, in the absence of people, strangely and defiantly alive. Deer and wild boar and birds moved through forests that no human family was allowed to enter. It stands as a perverse kind of monument. The same poison that had driven thousands of people from their homes had created, in their absence, one of the least disturbed corners of the entire industrial Soviet Union, a place where the deadliest legacy of the arms race and the quiet return of the wild came to exist side by side. Now, the men who ran Mayak were trapped, and it is worth pausing to understand the exact shape of that trap, because it explains the desperate choices that followed. They could not undo the contamination of the land. They could not admit what had happened, because admission would mean confessing to their own people and to the watching West that the flagship of the Soviet atomic program had suffered a colossal and deadly failure. And they could not stop producing plutonium because the arms race with the United States was accelerating with every passing year, and the demand for weapons material only grew. They had to keep the poison factory running at full speed while pretending to nearly everyone alive that nothing at all was wrong. The lake sat at the center of that impossible position, still holding its immense burden of waste, still assumed to be a safe container, still quietly waiting for the weather to expose the lie. And in 1967, the weather obliged. That year, a severe drought settled over the region. Water levels fell across the whole area, and the shallow, poorly replenished basin of Lake Karachay began to shrink. As the water receded, it exposed something that should never have been allowed to touch open air. The bed of the lake, that thick layer of radioactive sediment built up over more than a decade of dumping, was laid bare around the shrinking margins. The sun baked the exposed mud until it cracked and turned to dust. And then, across the dry Ural steppe, the wind came. It found the loose radioactive dust lying on the exposed lakebed and lifted it into the air. The wind carried that poisoned dust out across the countryside, spreading contamination over an area of roughly 1,800 square kilometers. Somewhere around 41,000 people lived within the zone that the drifting dust reached. The total amount of radioactivity carried off by the wind in that event was far smaller than the Great Cloud of 1957, a matter of a few hundred curies rather than millions, but its meaning was enormous and impossible to ignore. It proved, beyond any argument, that the fundamental assumption behind the entire Karachay strategy had always been false. The poison would not stay where it was put. A lake with no outlet was not a safe container after all. It was a reservoir of death that could rise up and walk on the wind the very moment the water covering it retreated. The geography that had seemed like a gift had become a loaded gun pointed at everyone downwind. That single realization forced the Soviet authorities toward one of the strangest and most audacious engineering campaigns of the entire Cold War. If the danger was the exposed sediment, and if the water could no longer be trusted to keep that sediment safely covered, then there was only one path left open to them. They would have to cover the lake themselves. They would have to fill it in permanently. They would, in the most literal sense of the words, bury a lake. The plan sounds simple until you consider what they were actually attempting. This was not an empty pond waiting for rubble. The bottom of Karachay was a deep layer of soft, saturated, intensely radioactive mud, almost like a heavy liquid in its own right. If crews simply dumped rock and rubble into it, the heavy fill would sink straight down under its own weight and squeeze that lethal sludge outward and upward, pushing contaminated material toward the edges of the basin and potentially forcing it down into the surrounding groundwater. The very act of trying to seal the lake could end up spreading the poison it was meant to trap. So the engineers devised a specific and clever solution. They would use large hollow concrete blocks, empty inside, so that they were light enough not to plunge straight through the sediment. Blocks that could be settled carefully into position to pin the mud down in place, rather than punch through it and squeeze it aside. Beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s, work crews lowered thousands upon thousands of these hollow blocks into the lake, along with carefully placed rock and soil, working slowly, section by section, shrinking the open water year after painstaking year. Nearly 10,000 of the special blocks would eventually go into the basin. It was slow, dangerous labor, conducted in some of the most radioactive conditions found anywhere on the surface of the planet, and it was carried out, like everything else at Mayak, under a heavy blanket of secrecy that kept it entirely hidden from the wider world. Then, as the 1980s gave way to the political and economic chaos of the collapsing Soviet Union, the money and the order that the work depended on began to dry up, and the burials slowed, stalled, and threatened to be left forever unfinished. The lake was not yet sealed, and the secret was about to escape. While Soviet engineers had been quietly trying to bury their monster, the ground had been shifting beneath the entire system that created it. The world was changing in ways Moscow could not control, and those changes were about to tear the veil off Mayak completely. In the late 1980s, under the policy of openness that came to define the final years of the Soviet Union, subjects that had been unspeakable for decades began, slowly and painfully, to be spoken aloud. And in 1989, the Soviet government at last formally admitted what had happened near Kishtim more than 30 years earlier. The greatest nuclear secret of the Cold War had finally been conceded by the very state that had spent a generation guarding it. But the truth had begun leaking out long before that official admission, and the way it first emerged is a remarkable story in itself. The man who did the most to alert the outside world was a Soviet scientist who acted from exile. Zyures Medvedev was a biologist who had fallen out with the Soviet authorities and been stripped of his citizenship while abroad. In the autumn of 1976, he published an account in a respected British science magazine describing an enormous nuclear disaster that had struck the Urals decades earlier, a catastrophe the Soviet state had never acknowledged to anyone. He wrote of contaminated land, of evacuated villages, of a poisoning carried out on a massive scale and then hidden. He did not have every detail correct, working as he was from fragments and from the accounts of other emigrants, but the core of what he described was true. The reaction in the West is among the most revealing chapters of this entire history. Medvedev was not immediately believed. On the contrary, in some quarters, he was openly ridiculed. Senior figures in the British nuclear establishment publicly dismissed his account as nonsense, as the fantasy of an unreliable exile, one leading official reportedly calling the whole story rubbish and a figment of the imagination. The idea that a nuclear program could produce a disaster of such magnitude was, to these men, simply too disturbing to accept, and here lies a quiet, deeply uncomfortable truth that only emerged later. Western intelligence agencies had in fact known about serious trouble at Mayak for years, pieced together from high-altitude reconnaissance and other sources, and they had chosen to say nothing. The reasons were not hard to work out once they came to light. At the very moment the West was trying to reassure its own anxious citizens about the safety of civilian nuclear power, and while operating its own plutonium factories that carried their own grave and closely guarded contamination problems, a confirmed Soviet nuclear catastrophe was an inconvenient truth for everyone in the business. Documents pried loose years afterward through Freedom of Information requests would confirm that American analysts had understood a great deal and had let the silence stand. In a strange, unspoken way, the secret of Lake Karachay had been kept on both sides of the Iron Curtain at once. When the borders of that closed world finally opened in the early 1990s, and outside scientists were at last permitted to travel to the region, they were confronted with the full scale of what had been concealed. A decree by the new Russian president opened the formerly sealed zone to investigation, and Western researchers were allowed in to measure for themselves. This was the moment those foreign scientists stood on the shore in 1990 and watched their instruments record a reading from open, unshielded ground that they had believed was impossible outside the core of an operating reactor. The lake called Blackwater had earned its terrible reputation not through rumor or exaggeration, but through direct measurement, verified by outsiders and documented at last for the whole world to see. Yet, even as the burial project was slowly resumed and the old secret gave way to daylight, the deepest danger posed by Karachay was not the one you could measure by standing on its shore. It was the one moving silently, invisibly, beneath the surface, in a direction that no wall of concrete blocks could easily stop. Water does not respect the boundary of a lake bed. Across all those years that the poison sat in the basin, some of it had been steadily seeping downward into the earth, dissolving into the groundwater and beginning a slow, patient migration through the rock and soil beneath the plant. By the 1990s, careful studies had confirmed the fear. A very large volume of contaminated groundwater, measured in the millions of cubic meters, had already spread outward from beneath the lake, forming an underground plume of pollution that was creeping through the earth at a rate of tens of meters each year. The worry was, and remains, that this subsurface poison could eventually reach the smaller rivers of the area, and through them connect once again to the great river systems that drain the region and carry whatever they hold far downstream. Burying the surface of the lake had addressed the danger from the wind, the danger that dust would rise again as it had in 1967. It had done far less to address the danger from below. The strontium, so mobile in water, had never once stopped trying to move, and gravity and groundwater were carrying it on a journey that will take not years but centuries to fully play out. To understand why that slow underground movement matters so much, you have to follow the water all the way. The rivers of this region do not simply vanish into the soil. The Techa feeds into the Isset, and the Isset into the Tobol, and the Tobol into the mighty Irtish, which in turn joins the Ob, one of the greatest rivers on Earth, on its long journey north to the Arctic. What enters the water in the southern Urals is, in principle, linked by that unbroken chain to seas thousands of kilometers away. It is the reason the contamination of a single small lake and a single modest river was never truly a local matter. A poison placed at the head of such a system is placed, in a sense, at the head of a whole continent's plumbing. That is the quiet fear that has haunted every scientist who has ever studied what lies beneath Karachay. This is the peculiar cruelty of the problem the Soviet engineers left behind for those who came after them. Some disasters end. A fire burns out, a flood recedes, a broken bone knits back together. This one does not end on any human timescale at all. The isotopes that make Karachay lethal will remain dangerous for hundreds of years, far longer than the lifetime of the state that created them, longer than the memory of the people who once lived beside the water, longer than any political system standing on the earth today. Whoever governs that stretch of the southern Urals in a century and in 2 centuries will inherit the plume moving quietly beneath it, along with the responsibility to watch it. The men who ordered the first load of waste piped into that convenient little lake made a decision whose consequences will outlive every institution, any of them, ever served. Confronting a hazard of this kind required abandoning the comforting idea that it could ever truly be finished, and accepting in its place the grim reality that it could only be managed indefinitely. There would be no dramatic cleanup, no restoration of the lake to what it had been in the quiet years before the bomb program arrived. The only realistic goal was containment, endless and vigilant, sealing the poison as thoroughly as human engineering allowed, and then watching over it effectively forever. The final phase of the burial reflected exactly that grim acceptance. In the years after the Soviet collapse, once the state had steadied itself and money was found again under a national program aimed at nuclear safety, the work that had stalled amid economic chaos was taken up once more and pushed at long last to its completion. In late 2015, the final fill was placed, and the open water of Lake Karachay ceased to exist as a lake. The following year, a capping layer of rock and soil was added over the whole surface, and a channel was cut around the upland edge to divert rainfall away from the buried mass, so that water would no longer pool where the lake had been and slowly drive the poison deeper into the ground. What had been the most radioactive open body of water on the face of the earth was converted, officially and finally, into a covered, dry storage site for the very waste it had always held. The lake was gone. In its place lay a sealed and silent field, The effort it took to reach that point is difficult to overstate. The full undertaking, stretched across parts of 5 decades and 2 very different Russian states, consumed an immense amount of labor, money, and engineering ingenuity, all of it spent not to build something new, but simply to contain something old, to undo, as far as it could ever be undone, a hasty decision made back in the early 1950s. In the end, the site was formally reclassified on the official record. What had once been marked as a body of water on the plant's maps was now marked instead as a permanent, near-surface storage facility for radioactive waste. In the cold language of the paperwork, it had become a solved problem. In every sense that actually mattered to the land and the water and the people, it was a problem that would simply never go away. The people who had absorbed the true cost of all this were not so easily covered over with rock and soil. In the decades after the secret finally broke, scientists studied the exposed populations with painstaking and sometimes uncomfortable care, precisely because their suffering, however terrible, carried lessons that could be learned nowhere else on Earth. The workers of Mayak, the villagers along the Teka, the people caught beneath the drifting trace of 1957, all became the subjects of long-running medical studies that traced elevated rates of cancer, of leukemia, of chromosome damage across the exposed themselves and onward into their children and grandchildren. Some of the downstream villages were resettled decades too late, in slow and bitterly contested programs that stretched well into the 21st century, long after the damage was done and the doses were absorbed. For many of those affected, official recognition and compensation came grudgingly, partially, or never at all. They had been sacrificed quietly for a weapon, and the state's very first instinct, at every stage, had always been to keep that sacrifice invisible. There is a bitter irony folded into that suffering. Because the people of the Urals were exposed so heavily and then studied so thoroughly, the data drawn from their bodies became some of the most valuable evidence anywhere in the world for understanding how radiation actually harms a human being. International bodies that set the safety limits for nuclear workers and for the ordinary public have drawn in part on what was learned from the Mayak workers and the Techa villagers. People who were never once asked whether they wished to be poisoned, and never told that they had been, ended up teaching the rest of humanity how to protect itself. Their unconsented sacrifice became, decades later, a grim and unintended gift to nuclear safety in countries they would never see. One historian who studied Mayak, alongside its American twin, coined a single word to capture what these places truly were, calling them plutopias, small utopias built upon plutonium. Her estimate, offered cautiously and by her own admission only as a rough approximation, was that each of the 2 great plutonium complexes, the Soviet one and the American one, released over the long course of the Cold War a total quantity of radioactivity into its surroundings equal to several Chernobyl's worth, not in one dramatic blast but as a slow, deliberate, decades-long seepage. Whether or not that exact figure is ever pinned down, the shape of the comparison is what should stay with you. The routine, planned, unremarkable operation of these factories, year after ordinary year, may have done more lasting harm to the land and water around them than the single most infamous nuclear accident in history did to Europe. At Mayak, the catastrophe was never really the exception. In a sense, the catastrophe was the everyday. Mayak, it should be said, did not close when its secret finally came out. The complex continues to operate to this day, no longer making plutonium for bombs, but reprocessing spent nuclear fuel, remaining one of the largest facilities of its kind anywhere in the world. It has continued to have incidents in the years since the Cold War ended. When an unusual cloud of a radioactive isotope was detected drifting across Europe in the autumn of 2017, independent scientists traced its most likely origin back to the southern Urals, to the region around this same complex, though Russian officials denied any accident had occurred. The beacon, it seemed, had never truly gone dark. The closed city beside the water endures as well. Ozyorsk still stands, still fenced, still guarded, its people still living in the long shadow of the complex that gives the town both its purpose and its wages. Whole generations have now been born and raised inside that perimeter, in a place their grandparents were once forbidden even to name aloud. For them, the plant is not a Cold War abstraction studied in books. It is the employer, the landmark, the reason the town exists at all. The bargain first struck in the years of Beria. Comfort and security in exchange for secrecy and silent risk did not dissolve when the Soviet Union itself dissolved. In its own quiet, stubborn way, that bargain is still being kept today. Step back from the individual details and the meaning of the whole comes sharply into focus. Historians who have studied both the Soviet and the American plutonium programs side by side have observed that the two great rivals, for all their bitter enmity, made strikingly similar choices when no one was watching. Both built secret, privileged cities to house the workers who made their bombs. Both bought those workers' silence with comfort and consumer goods. And both released staggering quantities of radioactivity into the land and the water around their plants, each gambling that the poison could be hidden or contained, or simply outrun by history. The tragedy of Lake Karachay is not, in the end, only a Soviet tragedy. It is a monument to a way of thinking that gripped an entire age, the conviction that national survival justified almost any cost, and that the cost could always be pushed onto someone downstream, someone downwind, someone who would never be asked and never be told. The men who chose that little lake as a dumping ground were not cartoon villains twirling their mustaches over a map. They were engineers under crushing pressure, working without a rulebook, because no rulebook yet existed, ordered to solve an unprecedented problem faster than any nation in history had ever tried to solve anything. They reached for the nearest available answer, a basin that could not drain, and they told themselves the poison would stay put because they desperately needed it to stay put. Everything that followed, the sickened rivers and the vanished villages, the burning sky over Kishtim, the dust rising on the drought wind, the plume creeping unseen through the rock, all of it flowed from that one comforting and false assumption. It stands as a lasting reminder that the most dangerous words in the language of any powerful institution may simply be, "It will stay where we put it." Today, if you were somehow permitted past the fences and the armed guards that still ring the Mayak complex, you would find no lake at all. You would find a quiet expanse of fill and grass and engineered soil, monitored and marked and watched, resting silent under the same pale northern sky that once shone down on open water. A visitor who did not know the history would see nothing remarkable about it. Only a flat and ordinary field where a small lake used to be. The needle of a radiation instrument held above that sealed ground no longer leaps to the impossible readings that once stunned the scientists who came before. On the surface, at last, the danger has been dressed and covered and put away. But a wound covered over is not the same as a wound healed. Beneath that ordinary field, the poison remains, lying exactly where it was piped and dumped and buried. As radioactive as the unchanging physics of decay demands. Patient in a way that no living person can ever be patient. And below even that, the water keeps moving, carrying its dissolved and invisible cargo through the dark, drop by drop and meter by meter, toward rivers and toward a future that no one who created it will ever live to see. The lake called Blackwater was made in secret by a frightened superpower, exposed by that superpower's collapse, and finally entombed by the country left to inherit it. The men who made it are gone. The secret is out in the open. The concrete is in place, and still, silently and patiently, under a field of grass in the Ural Mountains, the deadliest lake ever made goes on, keeping its own strange and terrible kind of time.